Peace everyone, Unmask Art here. Welcome to another pastel project. This is a recent pastel project I just finished up in the art club of one of my favorite scenes from one of my favorite movies, and that is My Neighbor Totoro. This movie came out back in 1988, which I was actually really surprised by. I didn't know this. I looked up some fun facts of the movie, and I didn't realize that this movie came out in 88. I just watched this movie a few weeks ago, and I still love it just as much as the first time I watched it. And it just felt so fresh that I didn't realize that it was like so old or made in the 80s at all. I wouldn't have guessed. It's such a beautiful film. If you haven't seen it, the entire time I was working on this project, I was constantly encouraging people to find the time to appreciate this movie and watch it. But honestly, it's worth buying. If you are one of those people that still buy movies, then this is definitely something that you should add to your collection. But anyways, I'll talk a little bit about the process of this project. As you can see, I'm currently using some pan pastels to fill in the background, and I've sort of just recently switched to using pan pastels for the backgrounds in my art club projects. All of these projects, by the way, are live tutorials that I do on my website. Of course, you can always view them for free when I'm actually live, but to access the giant archive of tutorials that I've done over the past few years, I would encourage you to sign up for the art club. I'll have links for it in the description and everything like that. But I've been enjoying working with the pan pastels to fill in the backgrounds of my projects. It saves a tremendous amount of time, and they lay down really smooth. So I'm working on pastel matte like usual. I always use pastel matte when I'm working with pastels. And this type of scene, I did a house moving castle scene as well. And what you're looking at is the masking film of the main subject. So you have the bus stop, you have Satsuki and Mei, and then Totoro all covered up. And that allows you to just put in the background without worrying about your main subjects. It's one of my favorite things to do with pastels, to preserve the paper in those areas. And the other thing that I do is I use ink to outline my subjects to make it look like the original animated version of the scene. And I did that in the Howl's Moving Castle project also. And it comes out looking really good. I think in this project I should have used a thicker pen for doing the inking, because I feel like the inking of this one, the lines are just a bit thinner than what I would prefer, but it still came out lovely. And so after I fill in the background, I'll peel off the masking film one by one and just do each main subject using the Carbothello pastel pencils. Anyways, so here I'm just putting in some of the foliage and continuing to do some of the base layering with the pan pastels. Now, as I get closer, I'm doing a little less of the pan pastels. The backdrop with the trees and just the darkness in the back, I covered the paper completely, but up in the front, I intended on using some of the carbothellos on top of the pan pastels. And this was actually the first time that I did this. I never tried a base layer of pan pastels and then applied the carbothellos on top, which may sound surprising considering how long I've been using pastels and how long I've had pan pastels, but I've never actually did it. And so I was hesitant to cover the paper fully because with soft pastels, pastel pencils don't really go on top at all. And I still needed to adjust the colors, and I also wanted to make more details with the foliage. And here you can see I started adding the pencils, and I was really, really pleased at how well I was able to apply the pencils on top of the light layer of pan pastel. Honestly, I probably could have even covered the paper a bit more with the pan pastel, but it was unnecessary. The layering of the pencils went down quite easily, and I was able to get some of those extra details that I wanted to put in the foliage just to make it look more like the original, because that was my plan, obviously, to make it look as close to the original as I could. So after I use a few colors of green here. I can't remember the numbers. Of course, in the live version, I always tell you what numbers I'm using, but I use a couple different shades of green to get the variation that I need. And I just cover everything the way it needs to be. And yeah, I really like the way the background came out. Here in a second, I'll be adding some of the finer details, some of the highlights on the blades of grass and all of that. And it really brings the background to life, makes it look more alive. But anyways, like I was saying, this is my favorite scene from the movie. It's just really well animated, and the atmosphere, the entire atmosphere of the movie is really, really nice. And without spoiling anything about the movie itself, this scene here is just where Totoro shows himself for the first time to the older sister. So the older sister, Satsuki, she is the one holding the umbrella, and her younger sister Mei is on her back asleep. And Mei has already seen Totoro, and they're waiting for their father to return. And it's raining, obviously. Well, it's not obvious yet, but it will be obvious when I add the rain later on. And it's just a fun interaction. Just the expressions and everything of this scene. Yeah, it's just adorable. Anyways, here I peel off the masking film, the first part of the masking film for the bus sign, and I begin filling everything in with the Carbothello pastel pencils. And you can see I did a little bit of outlining. The only part that I outlined was the umbrella on this sign here, and that's the way it is in the animation as well. The sign is painted in, and the umbrella is drawn in with ink. I think it's because the umbrella is animated in the scene, because they bring the extra umbrella for their father and they end up giving it to Totoro. Now, the original sign also in Japanese has the location and like the bus route. And I decided not to add the original Japanese to the sign, and I wasn't 100% sure what I was going to do with it, so I left it blank for a majority of the time that I was working on the project. I decided to add something later on once I settled on what I was going to write on it. And I was really pleased with how it came out after I finished the sign. Writing on the sign is actually the very last thing that I do, aside from putting in the rain. The rain is actually the last thing that I do in this project. Just taking my time here, filling in the blue part of the sign. Once I get the sign filled in, I do a little bit of aging. I sort of make the sign look a little older and rusty. I also add a little bit of text. It's not really text, but sort of the bus schedule on the little plate below the sign. So I used some various grays and browns to sort of bring in some rustiness to age the sign a little bit. A little bit of white to add a nice little highlight around some of the edges. And then of course I begin working on Satsuki and Mei, outlining the umbrella. Now I was using a 0.3 millimeter pen, and I was sort of double lining things with it. That should have been the first clue, that I should have went with a thicker pen. I would say I would recommend a 0.5 millimeter for anybody that intends on redoing this project. A number of people have followed along on this project, and I believe I mentioned it near the end that I would have preferred to switch, or preferred to have done this project with a 0.5 millimeter. In a lot of ways, the ink prevents the pastel from sticking to the paper, so you don't have to be super careful with filling in the colors with your pencils, because you won't really ever be able to cover the ink because it just doesn't stick very well. But it does get a little foggy, so the dust of the pastels turns the ink more of a grayish color, and so more often than not, you're going to need to re-ink the project a little bit in some areas once you're done coloring it in, which isn't an issue. The ink is very easily reapplied once you're finished filling in the color. But I think it would have been even easier, and it would have made the lines more bold to have gone with a 0.5 millimeter. I guess I was just a little worried about having my lines too thick, but yeah, I think a 0.5 millimeter would have been a better choice for this project. And I'll keep that in mind, because I'll certainly do more projects like this in the future, sort of capturing some of my favorite scenes from my favorite Miyazaki movies. I might do a Spirited Away scene next, if I do something like this in the near future. I'm not sure. There's a lot of good Miyazaki movies that deserve to be captured in this way, so I'm not short on any inspiration in that regard. I really like doing projects like this. The animation in the movies is just so good, and I love the subtle touch of realism in the backgrounds and the scenery, and just the way the characters sort of boldly stand out from it. Especially in this scene. This is probably why this is one of my favorite scenes, because the contrast between the dark, sort of almost gloomy backdrop of the rain and just the brightness of the characters, the way that they are contrasted on the background. I think that's what makes this scene just look so nice. The colors as well. Just if I were to create my own scene like this, where if somebody were to describe this scene to me without it ever existing, say this movie never existed, and somebody was like explaining this type of scene, these colors just wouldn't come to mind for me to use. This bright teal, this bright pink and orange and yellow, I just wouldn't choose these colors. And I think that it would have been, I think that if I were to choose different colors than what you see here, it just wouldn't be as good. There's just something about the bright nature of these colors against that dark background that just makes it that much nicer, that much more interesting. And that's something that I've been trying to work on for like my whole life, is choosing these bolder, more extravagant colors in my original artwork. Because I have a tendency to lean towards the more natural earth tone colors. I don't do enough of the super bright and the vibrant. And I'm aware of that, and so I'm trying to use what I learned from these projects, because even though I do these as a lesson and I talk you through the whole process during the live streams, I also am in a constant state of learning as I'm doing these projects. Because clearly I've never practiced this particular scene before. This is my first time doing this scene. And so every time I do a new project, I learn a little bit more about my own tendencies and what I like and what I need to work on. And I'd say being a bit more adventurous in my color choices, probably something I can still learn a lot about. I'm not sure exactly what it is about the bright and fun colors that I tend to avoid, but when I see them in scenes like this, they just feel so natural. But when I'm trying to choose them myself for my own original stuff, I don't know, I guess I just fear them a little bit. Because the colors in this scene are they're just perfect. I wouldn't change anything about anything of this scene. Maybe that's the natural bias we have towards other people's artwork as well. We always have this tendency of comparison when you see really nice artwork. We always have a a critical perspective in comparing our artwork to other artists, and oftentimes it's in a negative way. And that's something that, you know, I've had to work on for many years, to not do that, to not feel that sort of discouraged feeling, thinking I'll never create something like that, or I'll never be able to do that kind of thing. We also have a tendency to apply this sense of perfection towards other people's artwork and never our own. And that's a difficult feeling to overcome, for sure. But when I see this scene and I just emulate the color choice for this scene, I just feel like the color choices, like, how do you even come up with it? Like, how do you come up with colors just so nice for the scene? I don't know. I feel like I don't ever come up with the perfect color scheme. And for this, I just feel like it exists. I just feel like the perfect color scheme exists in this scene. It baffles me a little bit. But again, I maybe that's just a bit of a perfection bias, since this isn't my original artwork, but a copy of just a masterpiece or something. That could be it. Anyways, as you can see here, I have began working on Totoro, and a lot of gray was used to fill in that shadow side of him. And there's a whole bunch more gray that I'm going to be adding to. This is just the lighter gray on the highlighted side of him. My strategy in this part was to work around the edge first, get the edge nice and clean and sharp, and then just scribble in everything in the middle. Now I gotta do his big round belly, and again, just another application of gray. This is a slightly different shade of gray. This is like a cooler gray, I believe I chose for this part. Oh, I also wanted to mention a subtle optical illusion that I didn't catch right away until I was choosing the colors to fill in Totoro. And I often talk a lot about optical illusions because we fall for them all the time. Our eyes are rather susceptible to falling for optical illusions. And color and value, there's a lot of optical illusions that we come across when it comes to color and value. And when I was choosing the colors for Totoro, I was looking at the reference photo, of course, and analyzing it, because that's what I do before I pick my colors. I don't do it haphazardly. I take the time, even with all of my experience, I still always take the time to double check my colors, make sure I'm also not falling for any optical illusions. And in the reference photo, and here as well, you can see when you look at the eyes of Totoro, you see them as white, like they're white eyes with the black pupil in the middle, and you don't really question it much. And when I was looking at the reference photo, I was looking at the eyes, and of course I see them as being white with black pupils also. But I was also able to identify that the white part isn't white, which is a general rule with eyes, but not so much when it's an animated scene. And I realized that the white part of the eyes is actually as gray as his fur on the highlighted part. So I actually used the same gray in the eyes that I did on the left side, the highlighted part of his fur, that light gray color. And when I saw it in the reference photo, I thought, oh, that's the same value of gray. Like the eyes aren't, I see the eyes as being white, but they're not white at all. They're completely gray. And I took a sample of the color of his fur, and I took my brush and I just drew a line straight from that gray fur right into his eye. And it was the exact same value, but with just a subtle change. The fur is a slightly more warmer color, but in the white part of the eye, it was a cooler color, so it was more of like a cool gray as opposed to a warm gray. But the value was exactly the same, and I just thought that was kind of cool. And I talked about it a little bit while I was coloring it in, because it's important to understand where some of these optical illusions come in, and the more optical illusions you are aware of, the less likely you are going to fall for them. So yeah, anyways, getting behind on the project here, you can see I'm putting in the rain now, and this is a little technique that I shared on the live stream. So my ruler, the secret to drawing lines in pastels is to wrap your ruler in glassine paper, and that allows you to lay the ruler down safely and draw straight lines in pastel. And then also on the sign, I wrote mask art in Japanese, and here's the final project, or the final result anyway. Anyways, I hope you liked the video, and I will see you in the next live stream. Take care. Peace.